Hello, everyone. I've just started the webinar, so I'll give people an opportunity to join us. Hello and welcome to our webinar today, which focuses on the Elite Significant Contributions Scheme, and we'll be reviewing the progress of that scheme to date. I'm Emma O'Connor. I'm an employment lawyer here at Boyce Turner, and I am joined today by Chris Harber, who is our Head of Immigration. Hi, Chris. And also I am joined by James Bowles, Managing Director of Transfer Edge, and also Andy Chrisley, who is the COO at Transfer Edge. Hello to you both.
Hello, everyone.
Great, thank you very much, and great that you can join us today. Just a little bit about Boyce Turner for those who don't know who we are. We are a full-service law firm based here in the Thames Valley, but we support clients in the UK, in Europe, and also globally. And Chris, tell us a bit about the work that you're doing in the business immigration team.
Sure. So, a wide range of services in our immigration team. We cover both business immigration, as Emma said, and we also cover a lot of private immigration as well. So dealing with high net worth individuals. We act for a range of footballers directly. So we handle their personal immigration affairs for them and their families and their staff. And we also act for a few clubs as well. So we handle the visa systems and visa applications for a number of clubs as well.
That's great, thank you. And James, Andy, do you want to tell us a little bit about Transfer Edge and how you support clubs?
Absolutely. Firstly, thank you all for joining today's session. I appreciate for some of you it's likely the biggest week of your season, or for others you could be enjoying a well-deserved break before the transfer window opens. I see a few familiar names, but for those I don't know, I'm going to start by giving you a quick introduction to Transfer Edge. So Transfer Edge was created to give clubs the best odds to acquire a GBE for any overseas player, while minimising the pain points and admin burden the post-Brexit rules impose. We believe Transfer Edge to be the most accurate and comprehensive GBE platform in the market, and unlike other GBE calculators, it's actually being created by people who worked at the FA and helped design the points-based system we have today. I myself led the redesign of the old appeals panel. That's now back in 2015, but my colleague Andy, who's also joined on the call today, he was actually responsible for the modelling of all the changes post-Brexit and only left the FA recently. So basically what you see in the rules today, you're now talking to the man that did all the modelling behind all the different criteria that could have gone into them. And so, yeah, not someone to blame per se for the complexity, but helped guide the FA and the leagues and the Home Office through the complexity. So just to give you sort of a quick breakdown of our services, at the core is our Transfer Edge platform, where we've got the live GBE scores for over 60,000 players. This includes all players from band 1 to 5 leagues and playing senior international football. Therefore, we believe that pretty much any player who satisfies the GBE criteria, whether it be the international auto pass or the 15-point threshold, should be on the platform. There may be a fairy tale continental run in either Europe or South America they haven't quite captured, but we can always check any player's score for you. And then, like other sort of GBE calculators, we actually forecast GBE scores for every player going forward. And so what we want to show there is when a player might reach the play-in thresholds to be eligible, or even more importantly, if they might drop below the threshold, because it's worth remembering that GB does last for 2 months. And so if you were to apply for one today, you wouldn't have to actually sign the player until the end of July. You just require a draft transfer agreement and player contract. The largest changes in scores come in sort of 2 areas towards the end of each season, when the final league position and continental progression points come into effect. and also around major international tournaments. So definitely the next 2 months is a very important time for all players' GBE scores. As well as having that forecasting, we allow you to track players that you might be interested in, and we'll even send you email updates when their eligibility changes. So if you've got someone on the watch list, you know they're going to hit 15 points. We'll just give you that reminder when they do, so you can apply for the GBE. And then a bit beyond that, we also try and embed with each club's sort of scouting team. So we have like an advanced search functionality that lets you search by league, position, nationality. The idea here is if you're sending scouts to a new league, you might want to give them some information beforehand so they know if a certain club's a non-starter, or because this club's had a run in sort of a South American continental competition, actually many of them are eligible. So just something to sort of help streamline your scouting process. We also allow that data to be embedded into your own scouting software. So we have an API that allows you to extract all of our data, both the current GBE scores, but also the forecast, so you can build that into your own platform. And then to really maximize your time and, as I said, sort of minimize the admin burden, we will manage all your existing GBE and ESC players. What I mean by that is we'll show simply for all your GBE and ESC players when their GBE is valid from and to, and whether they meet the extension criteria. So you don't have to worry, oh, how many players have I got on a GBE, when do they all expire? We'll happily work with any law firm you work with to track that. Us ourselves have experience over sort of 300 applications between Andy and myself. We've never had one sent back from the FA. So if you know you want a player, just let us know. We'll make the application. It's all handled, and you receive the GBE in your inbox. Again, that's the other sort of real value add we feel, is that once you identify a player, we'll deal with the sort of end-to-end GBE process. And then if for any reason there's a player that you can't get through the criteria or an ESC, we do have a 100% success rate on exceptions panels for youth players. So that has changed a little bit in the ESC rules. They now count towards one of your ESC places, but beforehand they did not. I would love to say we have 100% success on exceptions panel for senior players, but that's a challenge, as any club that's gone to one of those panels knows. We have got a number of players through, but you truly have to show it's exceptional circumstances that prevented the player from reaching the points. So it can't just be a combination of near misses. It has to be there's something in his playing history. So we've seen sort of family bereavement, long-term injuries, those sort of things. War in Ukraine, that has actually limited a player from playing any senior football for an extended period of time. And again, they have to score between 10 and 14 points on the GBE points to get that to an exceptions panel. Anything you would add, Andy, there?
No, to be honest, I think you've covered everything very well. There's very little for me to add, really, other than it's very nice to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me. I was at the FA for 9 years as a lead data scientist before moving on to transfer. So I've been around for a while from an FA perspective, and I've been involved in this process for quite a long time as well. So nice to be here. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you both. Just a bit of housekeeping. Obviously, we're live and we will be sending out the recording of today's session. Also, if you have any questions or any comments or observations, then please do put them in the Q&A, and we can either deal with those as we go through, or we can ask questions. There'll be some time at the end. And again, just a reminder, this is an overview. So if you want to find out any specifics, any more information, then please do get in touch with either Chris or Andy and James, and I'll be giving you some details of how you can do that at the end. So what are we going to be talking about today? Well, we're going to be putting the ESC scheme into context. We'll also be looking at what the eligibility criteria is, before then looking at how clubs can assess what places they have available. One important thing to consider is how we're going to transition players out of the ESC places, and then at the end we'll be giving some tips and some hints on how you can maximize the number of ESC places that are available to your club. But before we start, we don't have a hotline to the Home Office, but rather fortuitously, last night the Home Office published some additional guidance, didn't they, James? Do you want to give us a little bit of an overview as to what that publication was and what some of the might be?
So the FA published the new GBE rules for the 2024-2025 season. So on their website, I'm sure some of the clubs on this call today were aware this was happening or have seen them before. But the good news from everyone's perspective is there's not a whole. It's a very only minor changes. There's not a whole suite of changes. I know last year we had the introduction of ESC and the complications that brought. So this year it's just quite minor. So if we talk through the sort of 4 main ones that stuck out to me, the UEFA Europa Conference League is now a band 2 continental competition. So previously that was band 3. That makes a big difference in both your continental minutes, but also your continental progression. You were really limited before in band 3. You had to play over 80% to even get a point of minutes, and you had to reach the semi-finals to get a point. That's now, I believe, if you get to the final, it's 7 points for the Europa League, and it's 5 on minutes for playing 100%. The Australian A-League is now a band 5, not a band 6. So that again takes you from 2 to 4 points. And again, there's the same change in your domestic minutes as a potential max being 4. And then one slightly negative one. So if a player club has appeared in 2 continental competitions, so let's say they were in the Champions League group stage and then they went into the Europa League, you now need to have appeared in both competitions if you're claiming to get the higher points. So before we just said you're in both competitions, you're eligible for the higher point competitions, but now you actually need to have played in it. So if you didn't appear in the Champions League, but then appeared in the Europa League, we could only claim Europa League points for you. We couldn't claim Champions League points. And then an important one for today is that the actual transition from when an ESC player can go to a non-ESC player has come down from a full 12 months to after 1 full domestic transfer window. So if you bought a player in the summer, post the winter window, so need to complete the whole window. So from February the 1st onwards, you could transition them to a non-ESC player, which importantly gives you that free ESC space for when the summer window starts. So otherwise timing was very important during the summer. That's now being removed.
James, just a question on that point 3. Is that on the team sheet for those competitions, on the bench, or physically playing on the pitch?
They don't define appeared.
Okay.
So we will query that as it's only out yesterday. My assumption would be they might need to play. But we'll have a look at that.
Yeah, no, brilliant. Thank you. Okay, so Chris, do you want to start us off by just giving us an overview of the GBE process?
Sure. So a lot of this is probably going to be bread and butter for all of you. So we'll just very quickly fire through the initial overview and where the ESC sits within the governing body endorsement process as a whole. So obviously there are 3 routes to being eligible to obtain endorsement from the FA. First is the most obvious one, which we're all very used to, where we have either the auto pass through international appearances, or the player has scored 15 or more points, and that's fairly straightforward in itself. Then we have the exceptions panel, which obviously James and Andy know all about. And then finally, where we're going to be spending the majority of our time today, is on the ESC criteria. And obviously you have kind of 2 aspects to that requirements, or to that route rather. You have the actual individual player ability, player qualification to meet the ESC criteria, and then you have your own ability as a club as well, and whether you make sure that you've got the places available to issue an ESC place to that player. So if we go through to the next couple of slides, so what is the ESC eligibility criteria? The Home Office definition is fairly loose. The actual sort of technical wording of it, and this quote that I've got on the slide here is taken directly from the FA's guidance on the GBE process. So all the club has to do is evidence to the FA's satisfaction that the player is an elite player and will make a significant contribution to the sport. They then go on to say that from time to time, the FA will update their guidance on what they consider to be suitable to meet this threshold. And at the moment, the criteria that the Home Office has set out is as follows. So it's falling into one of these areas. Now, very importantly with this, the wording in the guidance, again, draws a lot of inference from this. So the FA say that they expect the player to meet one of these rules. Not that the player must, but that the FA expects the player to meet these requirements. So what does that mean? That means if you have a situation where you want to sign a player that doesn't necessarily meet the ESC rules, You still have the exceptions panel open to you as a route to go down as we did in the past with youth players. But very importantly, if you do get a successful outcome from the panel, it takes up one of your ESC places. So you still have to factor that into the number of slots you have available for the given season if you go down the exceptions panel route with a youth player. So this is the criteria that's in place at the moment. As you can see, this is fairly straightforward, fairly self-explanatory. Either youth or senior competitive appearances for your country if they're in the top 50. At least 5 for the country if you're outside of the FIFA's aggregated rankings, if you're outside the top 50, sorry. And then either at least 1 continental youth or senior competition match, or at least 5 domestic youth or senior competition matches. So fairly straightforward as a basic eligibility criteria. If we go on to the next slide, please. Anyone see South, James?
Yeah, James,
Yeah.
do you want to talk us through how Transfer Edge can support with this process?
Yeah, so for every player, if they don't pass the 15-point threshold, we'll show whether they're likely to pass an ESC. So we can't say they'll absolutely be granted an ESC because of the word, and as Chris mentions on, but we can tell from their playing experience whether they've met one of those criteria and are therefore likely to pass. I've not seen the FA decline on any player who's met one of the criteria, so that's a good sign. We cover majority of the competitions they list, but there's a few youth competitions we don't. So sometimes you might have to reach out to us and go, can you double check this guy's background? But we will again, we'll check all those ESC criteria and see if the player meets them. The only thing to add here is they might be on 12 points today. If we'll have that forecast. If they're going to go to 15, let's not use an ESC place on this player. So it's always worth checking their GBE score, the forecast of it, and then their ESC eligibility in that order.
That's great, thank you. So I'm assuming, Chris, that obviously the assessment is going to be absolutely key in this process.
Yeah, and this is where it really comes down. This is where the real nitty-gritty of the rules becomes in place. Like I said, the actual eligibility of the individual players is fairly straightforward to get your heads around and fairly easy to assess. It's how you assess how many places you've got available to issue in a given season. So we obviously introduced the rules for last season, and so we had a basic sort of criteria for last season to go through, and the entirety of the basis of how many places you have available to you is based on your English qualified player minutes, your EQP minutes. Mm-hmm. So really simply put, it's anyone eligible to play for England will contribute to your EQP minutes, regardless of whether they've been selected before or whether they stand a prospect of being selected in the future or not. Really importantly, minutes can only count from qualifying matches. So as with most other areas within the GBE rules, you can discount friendlies from meeting the requirements. However, there is a very specific area with this where we look at what meets a qualifying match. Now, if you read through the FA's guidance on what counts as a competitive match, it jumps over a little bit, and it has to say what does meet the criteria. So you end up having to read through several different lines to try and figure out what doesn't. So we've worded it in a slightly other way, in the sense of what doesn't. So effectively, you can say that if you're a Premier League club, every competitive match you play in will qualify, apart from FA Cup matches before the quarterfinals and League Cup matches before the semi-finals. And then if you're in the Championship or League One or League Two, then again, every competitive match, apart from the FA Cup before the 5th round and the League Cup before the quarterfinals. So then you can see there's a fairly clear-cut sort of demarcation point there of what you will consider competitive and non-competitive. It's quite important to emphasize as well that even if you assume that you play in every available match that you can possibly play in a season, so let's say, for example, you're a Premier League club and you reach the final of every competition you play in, league matches are overwhelmingly important with the stats. So again, if you play in every single match available to you through the season, your league appearances still count 76% of the total EQP minutes throughout the season. So even if you have fantastic cup runs throughout the season, the league is still the fundamental basis of where you are going to be drawing your EQP minutes from. So it's really important that the league is where the focus is at in terms of assessing and making sure that you're looking at your EQP minutes. And if we go on to the next slide, Emma. So what we've tried to do, we've tried to break down how you assess your EQP minutes in a step-by-step process. And again, the FA's guidance jumps around a little bit, partly because it has to in the nature of the way that it's structured. So what we tried to do, we tried to lay it out in a coherent structure as to how you figure out what your EQP minutes are. And the end result of all of this is to figure out what your weighted EQP minute percentage is, because that number will determine how many slots you have. And we'll go on to the next couple of slides where we'll look at the number of slots that are based as being available. So when you run through this in a linear process, it's fairly self-explanatory. The first thing you need to do is look at each qualifying match. So calculating the number of EQP minutes you have in that match. And the formula that's at step one is how you do this. So you take the number of EQP minutes throughout the match. You divide that by the total minutes played during the match. So it's going to be number of appearances, so number of people that appeared and their minutes that they've played. You times that by 100, and then that gives you your EQP minutes per match. So, for example, if you have 450 minutes of EQP minutes in a match, and the total minutes played throughout the whole team during that match is let's call it 1,100 minutes, that gives you 0.40. So then when you times that by 100, that gives you an EQP of 40%, which, as we'll see when we go through to the next slide, is quite high and will give you a very good allocation indeed. So you go through that for each match. You have to do this for each match in the reference period. So the reference period is the 3 years immediately before the season that we're looking at. So for the 24-25 season, you need to be calculating back to the 21-22 season. So the 3 immediate seasons just completed. Once you've got all the minutes lined up, you take each match in each season. So you take each season as it comes, and you rank them from highest to lowest. So you have a list of all the games you've played throughout the season. You'll take away the 4 top matches and the 4 bottom matches. So the 4 matches where you have the highest EQP minutes, 4 matches where you have the lowest EQP minutes. And you do that for each of the 3 seasons. So you'll have 3 separate season lists. You then, and there's a lot of steps to this, you then can add some minutes for EQP player minutes for players that you've loaned out to other clubs as well. So at this point, you then add 50% of the playing minutes of loaned out EQP minutes, add that onto your total. Then you add each seasons together and you repeat that calculation. So you get the cumulative totals. So it'll be cumulative EQP minutes divided by the cumulative total minutes across the reference period. Divide those, times it by 100, and then that gives you your weighted EQP minutes percentage. And that will be, unless you are a very high EQP club, it's going to be realistically somewhere probably between 20 and 30 to 35%, depending on the number of EQP players you have within the squads. So if we go on to the next slide, Emma, we'll then be able to see what the numbers look like and how that actually translates into what you have. So these are the numbers that were allocated for last season, the first season that the ESC was introduced. So as you can see there, every club, as an absolute minimum, was granted 2 ESC places, regardless of your EQP minutes or not. Obviously, for League 1 and League 2, you could only have 2. That was the maximum number that you had. If you're in the Premier League or in the Championship, then if you had more during the reference period for last season, if you had a higher weighted EQP minutes, then you were granted additional places. So obviously the reference period for last season goes back to the 2020-2021 season. So if your percentages for those meet those thresholds that are on the slide there, you'll get either 3 or 4 slots that you could have used at that point. That's now been updated because we're now one season into it, and clubs have got more time to assess the rules and know what sort of calculations you need to be doing and how to actually start influencing the numbers. So if you go on to the next slide, Emma, we'll then look at the 24-25 season numbers. So as you can see, there is now the ability to have those numbers reduced, depending on what the ESC numbers look like. So League One, League Two, you're still in a position where the maximums are 2. That can drop down to 1 or potentially 0 if your ESCs drop quite low. Premier League and Championship, as you can see there is now the ability for your numbers to be reduced if you have particularly low EQP minutes. If your EQP minutes is below 20%, then you drop off and you lose your ESC places entirely for that season. So this is when the calculations start to become really, really important, and we start to need to look at how you're actually assessing, making those decisions around selections depending on where the ESC preferences sit. A couple of important points to make on the numbers that as we move into the 24-25 season and forwards are that relegation does not affect your existing ESC players. So if you currently have ESC players, and say for example you get relegated from the Championship to League One, if you have four players, if you're maximising your spaces and you have 4 ESC players, then they're not going to get taken away from you. For example, you keep the players effectively. However, when the player leaves, or when they transfer to become a non-ESC player, and we'll talk about that transfer process in a minute, you're not able to use those ESC places to recruit anyone else until you've got down to the number of places that you're eligible for. So using that example again, if you're relegated from the Championship to League One and you have 4, you would then need to either wait until at least 3 of those players have left or transitioned onto onto the GBE process and non-ESC players to then free you up to have an extra slot, because the maximum you can only have is 2 in that season. I hope that makes sense. It's quite a convoluted and quite a confused sort of way of explaining that, but it's effectively how the system is going to work as we move through the future seasons. What we're also going to have as well from next season is factoring in prorated minutes for injured players as well. So for each EQP qualifying match played by the club during the reference period, so that 3-year period going back from the current season, where an English qualified player was unavailable because they were injured, you can use prorated minutes for that injured player, and you can add that to your total minutes. There's a couple of important distinctions within there. To be classified as an injured player, the player must have been injured on international duty for England. James, and I'm not sure if that means actually injured whilst playing an appearance, or does that mean injured during training, for example?
I think both. I think both would be acceptable. It sounds like a really odd rule. It's just because look, we know when a club gives a player to a national team and they come back injured, there's nothing more infuriating. So I think they've just recognised that and put it in. We don't expect it to impact a large number of players, but.
Yeah. Brilliant. No, thanks, Andy. So James, and then the prorated EQP minutes as well. This means that the way you calculate what the prorated number of minutes is going to be is that you need to take the total number of minutes played by the injured player in the 12 months for you before they had their injury, and then divide that by the total number of matches in the same period, and then that gives you your prorated numbers. As James said, it's probably quite a niche area. I doubt there'll be too many situations come up where that's going to make a big difference, really.
So it doesn't cover people who are injured playing in the domestic game. It's only to do with international representation.
Unfortunately, it's only international, and the good example of that, which will have a big impact on EQP minutes for the last season just gone, is Aston Villa and Tyrone Mings. So obviously Tyrone Mings suffered a fairly serious knee injury, and I think the first game of the season, and he's missed the entirety of the season. And obviously he's a player at Aston Villa where, short of injury, he would be effectively playing almost every minute of every game for the club because of his importance. So that's a sort of position where Aston Villa are going to have their EQP dropped a fair bit because obviously Tyrone Mings was unable to play this season, and because that was for club rather than international duty, then that has that unfortunate knock-on impact.
Yeah. Okay, so if we think about those allocation figures that Chris, you just talked about, how should clubs be assessing their processes?
So, and James and Andy will talk to this in a lot of detail in a minute. It is data. It is almost exclusively data driven and how you manage that process. And James and Andy are in a really good position to talk about how the data is sort of needs to be scrutinized and looked at. Fundamentally, it is always a balance with these sorts of things, because you have to decide on where the priorities are in terms of sort of what the scouting team are looking at, what your future planning is with what sort of players you're looking at bringing into the club, what the transfer strategy looks like for the next couple of windows, and then sort of tying in all of the data around your EQP minutes and knowing exactly where you are as a club compared to what your transfer strategy is. Now, obviously, if you're in a position where you're likely signings for the next couple of windows, you're not really necessarily going to need to use the ESC system, then it's of less importance to you. But if you're in a position where you have identified a player or two where you really see a future for them and you want to bring them into the club, and you would need to use the ESC route to be able to sponsor them or to be able to get endorsement for them, then knowing where you are from an EQP perspective is really, really, really important.
And just thinking about those allocation places, we just had a question through, so I'll probably deal with that now if I can.
Yeah.
So can the additional places, can they be added on top of the maximum number of places granted through the EPQ minutes? No,
they can't. So if you have availability, I'll go through how you get them in a second on the slide. But if you've already maxed out, so for example, if you're a Premier League or Championship club and you already have 4 ESC places, then even if you meet the criteria that's on the slide, you cannot go above 4. Whereas if you're on 2 or 3, then obviously you can go up. So there are 2 potential ways that you can get additional ESC places, depending on whether it's a senior player or a youth player. So you will get 1 additional place if during the reference period, so the last 3 seasons that we're looking at again, on average, you have 3 or more English qualified players who make at least 3 appearances for the England senior team of 45 minutes or more per match, and those EQP players have played in 30% or more of the available matches within that period, then you get an additional slot. So simply put, if you have 3 or more regular England players that are playing for you on a regular basis, then you will get an additional slot through there. You can also obtain additional place for youth players as well. So same basic criteria, but not including the 30% rule for the club. So if over the last 3 seasons, again, during that reference period, on average, you've had 3 or more youth English qualified players who have played at least 3 appearances of 45 minutes or more for either the England under 20 or under 21 teams, you get an additional slot through that place as well.
That's great, thank you. So James, the data, and how do we scrutinise the data? Can you talk us through that?
Yeah, so it's obviously a very complex calculation. I hope that some clubs get support either from their leagues or their data team, but if you don't, we do all the work for you. So we have a page called ESC status, and we'll show you the number of places you have at the moment, and we'll also show you a forecast of your next season. So we track all your playing time over the year, and so not that helpful now. There's only a week left, and so you kind of know what your number is for next season at this point. But throughout the season, you kind of see that percentage change, and what we'll show you is what your percentage is today. So this one here is 59, and we might say if you reach 62, you'll reach another threshold over the 3 years. So what we're trying to do is as I said, track your playing time and how much you would need to hit that upper threshold. We also do the England players, both senior and youth. What's interesting is that affects almost next to 0 clubs. So it looks like a nice to have, but in reality, there's so much change in the starting teams, and to play over 45 minutes, you're having your base, your starter at that point. So you've only got 11 senior stars and 22 on the youth teams, and then you need to do it over 3 seasons. It's just really difficult, we've seen.
Yeah. I mean, I'm assuming going back 3 seasons isn't a problem.
No, not. I mean, all the data providers have this stuff, so it's pretty simple. We'll show you your percentage each season, and then we'll show you where you are at the season current and what the new average would be.
Can I just ask quickly, if we go back one slide, does it show just the top bit without it scrolling down? Because I think that's quite helpful to see just there, because it sort of went down quite quickly, just what the table does look like for an individual club on this perspective. So because it sort of just went a bit quickly on there. So just honing in on this, yeah, we have the 23-24 season number of places as it stands, with the detailed breakdown as to how those ESC places are garnered, and then the forecast for 24-25. Again, how those points are garnered as well, and that's obviously per individual. And then as you could then scroll down further in the page to get a lot more information on that, but the top bit is kind of like your key statistics, if you like.
And there's just the whole page there, isn't it, of all the data?
Yeah, exactly. There's lots on there.
That's great, thank you. We can see all those statistics there at the bottom, as you mentioned there, James. So let's think now about transitioning, because obviously that was something that we wanted to flag. And Chris, what are the issues there that clubs should be considering?
Yeah, so you've gone through the process. You've signed players through the year, so you've got them into your system. Obviously, you can only have a maximum number of slots at any one point. So how do you protect your slots? How do you make sure that you've got those slots available to you for future seasons? And really, the key sort of knowledge that I would say is worth taking away from today is that if you use the ESC correctly and you manage it properly in terms of transitioning players out of ESC and into the regular GBE process, then you can go through a season where you have several transfer windows go through. You can be in a position 2 or 3 seasons where you have assembled a core of the squad where you're able to access a level of talent that you wouldn't necessarily otherwise be able to access because of the points requirements, and keeping them transitioning slower. And the core rub of it essentially means that you're able to access players at a much earlier in their career, in a position where they are much more financially available, and it gives you an awful lot more viability to sign very good, high potential players much sooner in their career. Or if you're a team that's either towards the bottom of the Premier League or sort of Championship League 1, League 2, finances are a little bit more constrained. It means you're not having to lose those players to bigger clubs because you've got no ability to sign them when you can afford them. You can sign the player at a point in their career when they are financially viable to you. So it just opens up your talent sort of future pipeline massively, really, with this. And it all hinges on being able to transition players out. So you've always got those slots available for future transfer windows. So you have essentially 3 options available to you for transferring people out. And as James said at the top of the call, the change that was announced yesterday has had a big impact on this. It used to be the case that you had to wait 12 months before you could transition a player out of ESC and into the regular GBE process. You can now do it after 1 full transfer window. Certainly with the first 2, obviously with the third criteria, which I'll explain, you still need that 12-month requirement anyway. But you could be in a position where with the first 2, where either the player meets the auto pass rule or they score 15 or more points, where, for example, you sign the player during the summer transfer window. In the first half of the season, they play on a regular basis for you, and they play in a range of competitions, and perhaps they make some appearances for their country, and the country is in the top 50 of the FIFA rankings. You could very quickly be in a position where you score 15 points to be eligible to move off of that. So that after the January transfer window, you can then move that player off of your ESC slot, and so you've freed up a slot, so that then for the next window, when you come around to the summer transfer window again, you're then in a position where you've already got that slot available. So you can make signings much earlier in the window than needing to wait for the 12-month period to be completed. Just keeps your options open. And then with that third criteria there, where it's within 12 months of being sponsored, the player is has played in 25% or more of the qualifying matches and has met the required percentage of minutes, and I'll explain the minutes in a second. You also then have that future proofing as well, where after a season, if they've had a good successful season, they've played on a regular basis for you, you transfer them out and that slot is freed up again. You are obviously, with that third requirement, still slightly tied by the 12-month rule. So you effectively need to have completed the entirety of a full equivalent season to get them off of the ESC. So depending on when they were signed might affect where in the transfer window you're able to move them off of ESC and move them into GBE. But it becomes really, really important on these to make sure that you're, certainly with that last one, that you're moving the players over effectively the day that they are available to move over to the normal GBE process, to lift them off of your ESC quota. And you can also tie this in as well with talking more widely about the international sportsperson visa in the rounds, is that when you sign a player on an international sportsperson visa, obviously when they do their initial English test and they just do the speaking and listening test, you can only get a 12-month visa for them. So what we tend to recommend players and clubs do is that as soon as the player is in the UK and they feel confident to go and do the full B1 speaking, listening, reading and writing test, get them onto the English test books. That means that you can then extend their visa for a much longer period of time. You can tie that in with this 12-month time cycle as well. So you're then in a position where you have a player who has got a decent length on their visa, so that's much closer to their contract rather than having to renew it every year. And they've then also dropped off of your ESC slots as well. So you've then got that slot ready and available for someone else that you want to sign in the future.
Let's have a look what that looks like.
Yeah, on those minutes. So there's various different thresholds for the required percentage of minutes appeared. So if you're for example under 21 and you're playing in the Premier League, then you need to be playing in 15% of the available minutes to you, and then obviously that goes up the further down the pyramid we go, and then it's slightly higher as well if you are 21 and over and you're still on the ESC routes. You need to be playing a few more minutes for your club as well, certainly in the Premier League.
That's great. James, if we just have a think about again how we can track players and obviously how we can use Transfer Edge's product to do that, perhaps you could sort of talk us through how that works, and Andy as well.
Yeah, I appreciate this is hard to see, but all we're doing here is these are dummy players as well. We're taking all the GBEs a club may have, whether they're long or short term with a GBE expiry, and then when you need to renew, when you need to extend them, we're just showing are they eligible for that extension. And look, if they're not, it goes to relevant interested parties, and we have a lot of success there. But obviously it's easier if they meet one of the criteria. So that's the GBE bit, and then the ESC transition below. Again, it's just the three ways that Chris talked through. Will show when they satisfy those criteria, and then when you can actually transition them to a GBE. So we just keep track of all this stuff, so you don't have to have various emails or a whiteboard containing it all.
Thank you. Andy, anything there you wanted to add?
No, not really. Just I guess the key point of what we're trying to say here is that whilst the rules in themselves may be somewhat complicated, and by the way, I did not create these parts of the rules, just to clarify before you guys hate me for it. This was after I'd left. Whilst the rules are somewhat tricky and convoluted and so on, what we are trying to do is make the process as simple as possible. So hence why we're providing these things which are just pretty clear. This is what's going on. So hopefully you can see from what we're showing you at least that the rules may be complicated, but we're showing them in a simpler way as possible.
That's great. And what other hints and tips can the three of you give really to help streamline the process for clubs?
So I think I've got a couple on the next slide. The main one to me that jumped out was obviously for the first season they had these sort of minimums in of 4 and 2 that Chris spoke to. If you're slipping below those for any reason, and you're reducing your number of eligible ESC places, you do have the next 9 days to fill one. So that might be something you want to do. You know, you'll be locked into those ESC players for a while, but you have got 9 days if you're forecast a reduction in your number. Chris also spoke about loaning players to add to you get half those minutes added to your calculation. That is true, but there's a few nuances, of course. So it's only if you're a Premier League club can you do this, and you have to loan them to a Band 1 or Band 2 league. So that includes the Championship, and it includes sort of numerous leagues across Europe, like the Belgian Pro League, Turkish Super League, Portuguese Premier Liga. So those are good options to boost your number of minutes. Obviously, if you're going to play them, you only get 50%, so don't send them. But if you don't plan to play them very often and you think it could help their development, that's something to look at. Just as a sort of FYI, if you get a youth player who's on an ESC and you give them a debut in either the Premier League or Championship, that'll make him instantly above the 15-point threshold. Great place to be. And he can transition to a non-ESC player, assuming that's the first time he's played in a Band 1 or Band 2 league. So it's a youth debut. And then the other one I would talk about is that if you're going to use an ESC place for a player who's unlikely to play, consider, like, again, with all players, you have the option of acquiring the player, loaning them to another overseas club where they might fulfill the GB criteria. What you don't want to do is bring someone in as an ESC player. You can loan them out, but they still stay in that ESC place slot, and then hope they meet the GB criteria. So I always tell clubs that, you know, you can get any player you want through this GB system. It just takes a bit of time, and it takes a willing sort of loan partner in particularly in a Band 1 or Band 2 league, who will give the person a debut or a little bit of playing time, and then they'll be able to qualify on the points. So yeah, so for those sort of far outside people, maybe consider that route rather than an ESC place. Obviously, I know there are advantages to getting the player in at the club and developing them in your own system, but if that's not always possible, something else to consider.
That's great, thank you. That was really helpful. So if you want to find out more from either Chris or from James, please do get in touch. Here are the contact details there. We'll also be sending out a copy of the recording as well with contact details. So again, do please get in touch if we can help. Just before we finish, just sort of, you know, putting you all on the spot, where do you see the ESC scheme going in the future? Do you think it will stay? Do you think it will go and be replaced by something else? What are your thoughts?
So I mean for next season, we look pretty confident. There might be a general election, or there will be later this year. That obviously will impact the Home Office policy. I think the ESC generally has been adopted quite well by clubs, and so I don't think there's any risk of it going anytime soon. But yeah, with the sort of any potential Home Office changes probably overshadow any of our opinions or those of the FA or leagues at this time. But I think the points-based system is here to stay. If changes were to happen, it's probably just a tweak to the threshold or number of ESC places or something like that. So there'll always be something to put a sort of a minimum bar. It's just where you put that bar and how complex you want to make it. But generally, as we know, these things as they build, they just become more and more complex over time as the parties negotiate around, you know, sort of edge cases.
Speaking more widely from the sort of the wider use of the immigration system, as James said, we are expecting in sort of the immigration industry, speaking sort of more broadly, so not necessarily football specific, but we are expecting a change of government towards the end of the year. All the indications that Labour have made around immigration policy, both regular and irregular immigration, is that they don't really foresee any significant changes in the short-term future. If there were to be any changes to the immigration system, it would be focused more around students studying at university and the asylum system, rather than being sort of tweaking and changing with other areas of the system. So I think certainly for the immediate future, the governing body endorsement process is fairly sort of safe and is here to stay, short of sort of season on season amendments and tweaks like we saw published yesterday. I don't really foresee wholesale changes to the way that the system will work. About the biggest thing that we have on the sort of the medium horizon that could have an impact is something called the Youth Mobility Scheme. So at the moment, if you are effectively, if you are Australian, Canadian, New Zealand, South Korean or Japanese citizen, you can qualify for a youth mobility visa that allows you to come and work in the UK for 2 years. Now that visa has a no professional sports condition imposed on it, but there is a suggestion that at the moment the UK are trying is the key word, to negotiate with a number of EU countries about expanding the scheme to other countries. And the pushback that's come from the European Union, both as the European Union Commission and also from each individual member states, is that the no professional sports condition on that visa may be something that they want to introduce to the negotiation table. So it may be that in the medium future we're in a position where the youth mobility visa allows the individual to be a professional sportsman in the UK, which would then mean that for those eligible countries you could sign a player on a youth mobility visa rather than needing professional endorsement, which would make things significantly easier. At the moment, certainly with the intentions of the Home Office at the moment, I cannot see them being willing to negotiate particularly far on that, because it would effectively, certainly for European countries, it would effectively roll back the Brexit negotiations, and would then open up freedom of movement, certainly to professional footballers. So I doubt that the Home Office will be willing to go as far as allowing that entirety, but there may be, because it's on the table for negotiation, it may be something that they can come to a compromise on.
As ever with all things employment law, immigration law and sports, it's watch this space. Thank you so much for joining me today. My thanks again to James and Andy from Transfer Edge.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
My thanks as well to Chris Harber for joining us.
Pleasure. Thanks, Emma.
Thank you very much. So we'll be sending out the recording, and enjoy the rest of your day. Many thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a good one. Bye-bye.